Good evening, and welcome to the Midnight Inquiry, your guide to cozy dreams and just maybe a bit of learning along the way. Tonight, we'll be taking a journey together back in time to Roswell, New Mexico, the north place of countless speculations and facts stranger than fiction. Before we get settled, please take a moment to like and subscribe so I can reach other sleepless souls like you. And if you could, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Now, let's begin our journey. There are moments in history that begin not with a bang but with a breath, silent, warm, and suspended. The desert surrounding Roswell, New Mexico in the summer of 1947 was a landscape carved from stillness. Not the silence of peace, nor the quiet of sleep, but a kind of anticipatory pause. The kind you feel just before thunder cracks open the sky. The kind where even the cicadas, relentless in their daily percussion, seem to sense that something is approaching. It was the kind of night where sound didn't carry and stars didn't twinkle. They just stared. Roswell then was a town of wide streets and narrow dreams, home to ranchers, shopkeepers, and a scattering of military families tied to the nearby Roswell Army Airfield, the base where the Enola Gay had once slept before its journey into infamy. War was over, but its shadow hadn't lifted. Men still saluted habitually. Women still counted ration stamps in their drawers just in case. And across the Pacific, a new enemy, the Soviets, loomed in the foggy eyes of American intelligence. But Roswell in those days still managed to feel untouched. At dusk it hummed with routine, screen doors creaking open, porch lights flickering to life, wind kicking up dry curls of earth along dirt roads. No one thought much of the sky. They lived beneath it, certainly respected it when it withheld rain or turned angry with dust, but they didn't look up and wonder, not really. The heavens were a stage too far away for local drama, and yet, on one particular night, something came down from that sky, folding itself violently into the world of the mundane. Before the newspapers screamed flying saucer, and before the government began its long, careful dance of denial, there was only that quiet. Miles outside the city limits, the Foster Ranch lay blanketed in pitch black. No streetlights, no headlights, just the yawning space between fence posts and the dim glow of stars, as ever-present as they were indifferent. And in that place of sand and scrub something fell. No cameras caught it, no radars tracked it, not officially at least. But somewhere in the dark something tore across the firmament and shattered the quiet forever. Maybe it didn't explode, maybe it didn't leave a crater, but it left a wound on the landscape, on the minds of those who found it, and on the trust Americans once had in the words of their government. To understand what happened in Roswell, you have to first understand what wasn't happening. There were no reports of missing aircraft, no alarms sounded, no military dispatches flooded the area. In fact, for several days, almost no one knew that anything had happened at all. The crash, if that's even the right word, wasn't announced. It was stumbled upon. But before we can get to that part of the story, we need to linger a little longer in the silence that came before. Because this is not a story that begins with answers. It begins with questions cloaked in darkness. It begins with a town too small to be ready, a base too secretive to speak up, and a rancher who found himself, quite by accident, at the epicenter of something much bigger than he, or anyone else, could explain. This is a story whose first chapter was not written in ink, but in wreckage, found in a still and silent desert where nothing was supposed to fall from the sky. The winds rolled in quietly at first, the way they always do in the New Mexico high desert, sly, dry, invisible. A stir in the mesquite, a ripple through the grass, the kind of movement you might mistake for nerves if you believed the land could feel. But the Foster Ranch, miles from anywhere most people had ever heard of, had learned to listen to the wind. It knew when the air was different, when the temperature dropped not from the time of day, but from something unspeakable hanging above. On that July night in 1947, something was in the wind, and the land took notice. Mac Brazel had been on that land long enough to trust it. His days were measured in fencing wire and boot prints, and his thoughts were as weathered as the cattle skulls that littered the brush. He didn't believe in much, except what he could rope, ride, or haul into town in the back of a pickup. If God had ever spoken to Mac, he'd done it in the form of a rainfall. If the devil had ever whispered in his ear, it sounded like a busted transmission. But even Mac could feel it, that something wasn't right. Earlier that week, a storm had gathered itself like a boxer taping up before a fight. Thick clouds rolled low, touching the sky to the earth with a threat. Thunder didn't crack so much as rumble, like an old engine trying to turn over. Lightning pulsed behind curtains of cloud, illuminating the night in strobes of suggestion. And then came the rain, sheets of it, cutting diagonally across the horizon, catching in the gullies and dancing in silver threads over the dry earth that hadn't known moisture in weeks. Some say the storm was unseasonal, freakish even. Not in its existence. New Mexico summers were no stranger to sudden squalls, but in its feeling. There was an oddness in its rhythm, a hollowness in the thunder. It was as though the sky wasn't just angry, it was confused. Animals behaved strangely in the hours before. Horses whinnied at nothing. Coyotes didn't sing that night. Dogs refused to lie still, and the cattle bunched in corners of pastures, their eyes fixed on something invisible overhead. At the time, no one thought to connect the dots. They were too scattered, and in 1947, pattern recognition wasn't a survival skill unless you were a codebreaker or a gambler. Most people chalked it up to weather. Unusual, maybe, but not unnatural. Lightning split the sky as it always had. Thunder followed loyally behind, and when the rain came, Mac Brazel did what any rancher would do. He waited it out in the barn, sitting on an upturned bucket with a thermos of coffee and the low moan of wind whistling through the wooden slats. But what fell from the sky that night was not just rain. There was no loud crash, no explosion to wake the desert. Just a strange shift in the atmosphere, like the air itself recoiling. Something streaked through the storm clouds, too fast and too quiet to be seen, but not fast enough to go unnoticed by the sky it violated. Whatever it was, and we'll get to that, the impact wasn't felt in tremors or sound waves, but in silence, a kind of hush that settled over the range like a held breath. When dawn broke, it did so in layers, not with the triumphant roar of sunlight, but with the slow, uncertain creep of grey light filtering through the humidity. Brazel emerged from the barn, stiff-backed and tired-eyed, squinting into the horizon as ranchers do, not to admire it, but to assess it. Fences, tracks, weather damage, anything that might set him back another day. But what he saw, scattered across a section of pasture about a quarter-mile long, stopped him cold. Debris, everywhere. Strange debris, not the remnants of a downed aircraft or even a weather balloon as he might have guessed later. No wing, no fuselage, no obvious structure, just a field littered with a kaleidoscope of confusion. Pieces of something that shouldn't be there and didn't belong to any machine he'd ever seen. Thin metallic rods, some of them impossibly light yet unbreakable. Sheets of a dull silver material that wouldn't tear, burn, or stay bent, no matter how hard you tried. And strangest of all, small, ribbon-like lengths of a substance that shimmered in and out of visibility when turned at an angle, like heat mirage wrapped in foil. At first, Mac thought someone had dumped garbage on his land. But what kind of garbage behaved like this? He tried to fold a piece of the silvery material, and it snapped back to its original shape as if it had memory. He crushed it in his calloused hands, and it sprang open again like a toy with a grudge. He tried to slice it with his knife. Nothing, no puncture, no tear. Just that odd, almost smug resistance. And the rods. They were covered in symbols, not letters, not numbers, but something that looked almost hieroglyphic. Purple in colour, inked or etched, he couldn't tell. The rancher stood there for a long while, unmoving, trying to make sense of it. It was not a puzzle he was prepared to solve. He gathered what he could, filled the bed of his truck with odd fragments, tying down the larger pieces with rope and wrapping the smallest in old feed sacks. It took time, hours, but there was no rush. No one knew what had happened, and out there on the range time moved like molasses. By the time he finished, the sun was directly overhead, and the metal pieces glinted back at it like they didn't belong in this world. And maybe they didn't. Mac Brazel did what any man of his disposition would do. He went into town. He didn't call a reporter. He didn't knock on the door of the local radio station. He went to the sheriff. And that's where the world begins to notice. But let's not move too fast, because something else happened before he made the drive, something no one talks about quite enough. Sometime between the storm and the sheriff's office, Mac went quiet. Not just with others, but inside himself. Friends later said he seemed changed, not afraid exactly, just off, like someone walking underwater, seeing the world through a pane of distortion. It wasn't just the wreckage that unsettled him, it was something else. Some say he found something more out there, something he never told anyone about. Others believe he was warned, visited, spoken to in the kind of conversation that doesn't get repeated. That's conjecture, of course. But what isn't, is this. When he arrived in town, Brazel looked like a man trying not to remember what he couldn't forget. He brought the wreckage with him, dropped it piece by piece on the desk of Sheriff George Wilcox. And that's when the story stopped being local. Next comes the call to the airbase, then the cordoning of the ranch, then the headlines, the retractions, the whispers, the myth-making, and the rewriting of history. But here, at this strange crossroads of storm and metal, of silence and suspicion, is where the road to Roswell really begins. Not in a crash site, but in the mind of a man who knew his land like the back of his hand, and woke one morning to find that something unnatural had landed in the middle of it. To call it wreckage is almost dishonest. Wreckage implies familiarity, a burned-out shell of something we understand, a smashed car, a crumpled wing, the aftermath of kinetic energy meeting resistance and failing the test. But what Mac Brazel found scattered across his ranch didn't look wrecked, so much as displaced, as though the materials hadn't crashed, but simply appeared, ripped from one world and unceremoniously dropped into another. It was wrong. Not in a dangerous or disgusting way, but in the way a puzzle piece is wrong when it almost fits. The curves match, but the picture doesn't, and no matter how many times you turn it over in your hand, it just doesn't belong. It began with the foil. That word has become something of a punchline over the decades, thanks in no small part to the aluminum helmets and paranoid tangents it tends to inspire. But this was not your mother's Reynolds wrap. This was something else. Something that deserved a different name. A thin, silvery sheet, smooth to the touch, cool despite the July heat. It had the appearance of metal, but it moved like fabric, bending with the wind, catching it like sails but never tearing. You could crush it in your palm, squeeze it into a tight, hard ball, and the moment you released your grip it unfolded, not like paper, not like a spring, but like something retracing its own memory, returning to a shape it never forgot. Some called it memory metal, but that term came later, decades later, when the scientists were allowed to peek, if they ever really did. Mac just called it that weird foil, and he found it in long strips, wide sheets and small confetti-like scraps, some of which clung to fence wire like it had been magnetized or pulled into place by static charge. It didn't rust, didn't smell like anything. When he tried to burn it, it turned black for a moment, then returned to silver. If it melted, he never saw it happen. It was like watching an object refuse to obey. And then there was the twine. Except again, twine isn't the right word, is it? Twine phrase. Twine has a texture, a logic. This was something else. Thread-like, certainly. Flexible, but far too smooth, too consistent. Not a single split end, not a single fibre to suggest that it had ever been woven. It was as if each strand had been grown, extruded maybe, like plastic from a mould. Only it wasn't plastic either. It had the look of fishing line, but the feel of hair. It didn't snap, not even when tied to the back of a truck and pulled taut over a fence post. And when you looked at it in the light, it shimmered. Not because it was shiny, but because it was almost translucent, like it wanted to disappear. Attached to some of the larger pieces, flat plates, barely thicker than a playing card, was what Mac could only describe as string glued to metal. But it wasn't glue, and it wasn't really string. It was embedded, as though the plates had been born with them already threaded through. Some of them ended in tiny nodules, beads, connectors, decorations. He didn't know, but they didn't look random. They looked deliberate. It was this strange combination, metal that moved like memory, twine that refused to break, rods that hummed faintly when pressed to the ear, that convinced Mac Brazel that he was not looking at the aftermath of a weather balloon. Balloons, he reasoned, are soft. Balloons pop. They fall apart. They leave behind rubber, or canvas, or little sandbag weights. This was not that. One piece in particular stood out. It was a small beam, no longer than a forearm, maybe 2 inches wide. Lightweight. Hollow, he thought, but unbending, unbreakable. Not cold to the touch like most metal, not exactly warm either, just ambient, as if it ignored the surrounding air temperature entirely. What fascinated Mac wasn't the beam's structure, it was the markings, symbols. That's what he called them, though that word barely fits either. Not letters, not numbers, not even shapes in any mathematical sense. They weren't scribbled or scratched. They weren't carved with a tool. They were the beam, as much a part of it as veins are to a leaf. They appeared purplish in the right light, violet, maybe even pink, depending on how you turned it. Not paint, not dye, something else. Later, Jesse Marcel, the base intelligence officer who examined the wreckage, would describe the same markings in his own words. Hieroglyphics. But not Egyptian, not Aztec, not any known script. More like pictograms, curved lines, dots surrounded by halos, arcs connecting shapes that felt deliberate but not decipherable. If they were a language, they belonged to someone who didn't want us to read them, or maybe someone who never considered we might try. The more Mac stared at them, the more they unnerved him, not because they were frightening, but because they made him feel dumb, like he was staring at the answer to a question he didn't even know how to ask. And that is perhaps the deepest kind of confusion a person can feel. To realise you're not simply lacking an answer, but lacking a frame in which an answer might live. There were other fragments, slivers of material too thin to be structural, yet far too tough to be ornamental. Pieces that didn't bend but didn't snap. One chunk was almost translucent, shaped like the wing of a model plane, only with no markings, no seams. Another was domed, like the inside of a helmet but with no padding. Some had holes, perfectly round, impossibly smooth, as if punched by something with a precision beyond any handheld tool. One piece was slightly curved and bore what looked like a raised ridge along one side, an edge that caught the sun in a way that almost hurt to look at. A few had burned edges, singed black, and yet they never crumbled. Even fire, it seemed, had only passed through. Mac tried to make sense of it. He arranged the pieces on his kitchen floor, tried to assemble them, toy-like, into something whole. A wing, a dome, a fuselage, a door. Nothing fit, nothing aligned. There were no screw holes, no bolts, no rivets, no hinges, no weld lines, nothing that implied assembly. And yet, they had been a thing once. They weren't naturally occurring. They were fragments, and fragments belonged to a whole. So what was the whole? That question would haunt him, and later the military, the newspapers, the skeptics, the believers, and 100,000 others, for decades. But for now, Mac just knew one thing. This wasn't garbage, it wasn't military, and it sure as hell wasn't weather. He didn't call the government, not yet. Instead, he took the wreckage to the only authority he recognised, Sheriff George Wilcox. Loaded up his truck with the strange metal, the twine, the symbols, and the broken pieces of something that should not have existed, and drove into town. And that's when the chain reaction began. The sheriff would call the base would send Marcel would take the wreckage, and history would change. But here, in the third act of the beginning, we sit with the fragments, not with the story, not with the myth, with the matter, with the twine that didn't fray, with the foil that refused to stay bent, with the beam that remembered things we'd never told it. There are moments in history where things change, not with a bang, but with the sound of gravel crunching under tyres. Mac Brazel drove the road from Foster Ranch into Roswell, like he'd done a dozen times before, only this time the back of his truck held the seeds of a story no one would be able to properly bury. Not for lack of trying, but because once you've touched something unexplainable, truly, skin-pricklingly unexplainable, you can't go back to normal, you can only pretend. It was a hot morning, already crawling past 90 degrees before the sun hit its peak. The air smelled like dirt and memory. Buzzards circled lazily over the low hills, their shadows dragging across the road like omens, and Mac, squinting under the brim of his hat, sat behind the wheel with one hand on the cracked leather, the other on the stick, shifting through the gears of a world that had changed without asking permission. He didn't go straight to the base. That wasn't the way men like Mac did things. The military was another planet. Uniforms, acronyms, and rules made by boys half your age. No. Mac went into town. Real town. Main Street. Roswell. Back then, it was a place you could name all the stores and all the men who owned them. A place where the sheriff still wore his badge like a handshake, and the diner poured coffee like it was holy. Roswell in 1947 wasn't the pastel playground it is now, littered with little green men and glowing-eyed souvenirs. It was cattle and cotton and cattle again. A place where gossip was currency and God was still local. On that day, it was alive with dust and chatter and the sound of fans spinning uselessly in shopfront windows. Mac parked his truck in front of the sheriff's office like it was any other day, but it wasn't. Sheriff George Wilcox had been sitting at his desk, fiddling with paperwork and listening to the soft whine of the ceiling fan above his head, when Brazel walked in. He looked up and saw a man who wore his tiredness like a second skin. Mac wasn't out of breath. He wasn't wild-eyed. But he looked off, not shaken, not spooked, just like a man whose world had been tilted 3 degrees to the left and who hadn't found his balance yet. "Morning, Mac," Wilcox said, casual. "George?" Brazel nodded. There was a long pause. Then, got something weird in the truck. Weird didn't mean much in Roswell. A calf born with 2 heads was weird. A bootlegger with a missing ear was weird. But the way Mac said it, that carried weight. Wilcox followed him out without another word. They stood at the back of the truck and looked in. Wilcox didn't speak for nearly a full minute. Some of the pieces were already familiar. The tinfoil-like sheeting, the sticks, the strange ribbons. But something in the way Mac had arranged it made it worse, like he was trying to make sense of it, and in doing so, had revealed just how senseless it really was. Wilcox reached in, picked up a piece of the foil, bent it, watched it straighten again. "What is this?" he asked. Mac didn't answer. "'Cause what do you say to that?" He just shook his head. "Didn't come off any plane I ever seen." Wilcox agreed. He took a deep breath, scratched at his chin, and glanced up the road in the direction of the base. "You talked to anyone else yet?" the sheriff asked. "No," said Mac. "Thought you should see it first." That counted for something. Wilcox stood there for another long moment, then nodded. "All right, sit tight. I'm going to make a call." Back inside, he lifted the receiver on the rotary phone and dialed the Roswell Army airfield. The woman on the line patched him through to Major Jesse Marcel, the base intelligence officer. Within the hour, Marcel was en route, his jeep kicking up a trail of dust like smoke from a fuse. Now here's where the record starts to split. Fractures, retellings, contradictions. But for a brief moment, everything was clear. A rancher had found something. The sheriff had seen it. And now the military was involved. Marcel arrived in uniform, crisp and composed, but with a curiosity that made him seem almost boyish. He examined the wreckage in the truck bed without touching it, then asked Mac to tell him everything. The 3 of them stood there in the sun, Brazel, Wilcox and Marcel, watching as a mystery grew legs. Mac described where he'd found the debris, the length of the field it covered, the storm that preceded it, and the eerie stillness of the discovery. Marcel listened closely, nodding at intervals but saying very little. Then he reached in and picked up the same piece of foil Wilcox had handled, bent it, released it, watched it unfold again. His eyes narrowed. "This isn't balloon material," he said, half to himself. Mac said nothing. Marcel stayed for another hour, maybe 2. Took samples, asked more questions. Then he did something that would change the entire story's trajectory. He told Mac to take him back to the ranch. They drove in separate vehicles, the sheriff staying behind in town. As the 2 men rumbled down the long road back to the Foster property, something shifted in Mac. The burden he'd been carrying since the storm, one of confusion and quiet dread, began to lift. Not because answers were on the way, but because the responsibility no longer rested entirely on his shoulders. Someone official was involved now, someone whose job it was to know things, someone who might look at all this and say, "Oh yes, we've seen this before." But Marcel didn't say that, because he hadn't seen it before. When they returned to the site, Marcel's calm demeanour began to crack. He was too experienced to panic, but something in the wreckage unsettled him. He examined the debris fields, walked the full stretch, picked up more of the material, studied the hieroglyphs. His silence was not the silence of understanding. It was the silence of someone rapidly discarding everything they thought they knew. That night, he loaded up his jeep with the remains, leaving some behind to be collected later, and returned to the base. Mac Brazel, for his part, returned to his house. The next morning he woke up and discovered that he was no longer just a rancher. He was a witness, and witnesses, in 1947, didn't always get to decide what they'd seen. What happened next is where the story fractures. Some say Mac was brought to the base and held for several days, that he was questioned, intimidated, even coached on what to say. Others claim he went willingly, confused but cooperative. The military's account would shift several times, just like the wreckage in Mac's hands, but from this moment on, the story would no longer belong to him. The town would talk, the press would stir, and soon the Air Force would issue the most infamous press release in UFO history, but we're not there yet. For now, we're with Mac, pulling into his driveway, the dust of the base still clinging to his tyres. The sun is lower in the sky now, stretching the day into evening. He steps out of the truck, walks to his porch, sits down, and lights a cigarette with fingers that tremble just slightly. Something came down in that field. He doesn't know what it was. He only knows it wasn't ours. And somehow, impossibly, that makes it feel like it's still out there, waiting. George Wilcox had a quiet face, the kind that suggested he preferred the sound of his own thoughts to the sound of most people's voices. His office wasn't much, just a small, sun-bleached building nestled between a barbershop and a five and dime. But in Roswell, that badge meant something. He wasn't just the law, he was the listener, the judge, the shoulder, the pressure valve. He'd settled arguments between ranch hands, diffused bar fights before they happened, and found more lost dogs than any man ought to. His whole career had been built on knowing the difference between a big deal and a tall tale. So when Mac Brazel showed up at his office and poured a box of confusion onto his desk, Wilcox didn't laugh, didn't scoff, didn't lean back and mutter something about too much sun. He squinted, he frowned. And then, without saying much at all, he walked outside to look at the truck. It was still there, still glinting in the sun, still refusing to make sense. For a man like Wilcox, practical, restrained, allergic to drama, this was a crossroads. He could brush it off, say it was debris from a test craft, maybe part of some classified weather project. Write it up, file it, forget it. Or he could do the one thing no small-town lawman ever wants to do, call the military. And it wasn't just any base. The Roswell Army Airfield was a different beast. This was the home of the 509th Bomb Group, the only unit in the world equipped to handle atomic weapons. The men stationed there weren't traffic cops in the sky, they were stewards of extinction, and that gave the base a certain gravity, the kind that pulls people towards secrecy, towards silence, toward a deeper shade of yes, sir. Still, Wilcox had seen enough. Back inside, he picked up the receiver and turned the rotary dial with calloused fingers. The line clicked. The operator's voice came on, cheerful and efficient. He asked to be patched through to someone in intelligence. A few minutes later, the voice of Major Jesse Marcel came through the line. Marcel didn't sound surprised, but he didn't sound bored either. "Tell me what you've got," he said. Wilcox did. He described the wreckage in terms both exact and hesitant. Said it looked metallic but wasn't heavy. Described the foil that unfolded itself, the beams with writing on them, the thread that wouldn't break. There was a pause on the line. Then Marcel said, "I'll be there within the hour." Wilcox hung up and sat for a moment, the fan above him slicing the air into thirds. Something had changed. The gear had shifted. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew the ball was rolling now. When Marcel arrived, the meeting was all business. No laughter, no flying saucer jokes, just quiet examination. Mac Brazel watched as the officer moved piece by piece through the debris. He was methodical, touched everything. Measured some pieces against the width of his palm, tapped the rods against his knee, bent the foil, tested the twine, said little. Wilcox stood to the side watching both men, one growing increasingly disturbed, the other more relieved, like he was passing the burden. Finally, Marcel looked up. "I'd like to go out there. To the ranch," Mac nodded. "I'll take you." And with that, Wilcox was left in town, alone now with the knowledge that something deeply odd had been dropped on his doorstep. He'd done what was expected, what was prudent. He'd called in the experts. But here's where things get strange. Over the next 24 hours, the sheriff's office received visits. Not just calls, visits. Some were military men, crisp uniforms, polite questions. briefcases with paperwork that was never left behind. They asked what Mac had said, what he'd brought, who else had seen it, whether anything was missing. Others, well, they weren't military exactly. No insignias, no badges, just quiet men in dark suits with serious eyes. One sat across from Wilcox without saying a word for the first 5 minutes, just stared. Eventually asked about the press, who Wilcox knew in the papers, whether anyone had called in, what stories were floating around town. His tone was calm, but there was a current under the words, something that suggested, this is bigger than you. Wilcox, to his credit, didn't budge, gave short answers, admitted little. But after the 5th visitor left, he locked the front door of the office for the first time in years. That night he went home early. His wife would later tell friends that he looked troubled, even haunted. He sat at the dinner table without touching his food, then got up and paced the kitchen. Eventually he poured himself a drink, something he almost never did on a weeknight, and muttered, "They're saying it's a balloon." But it isn't a balloon. He didn't elaborate. She didn't push. In the following days, the phone rang more often, some reporters, some officials. One call came from a man who claimed to be with Army intelligence, asking detailed questions about Roswell, about the sheriff's notes, about whether any civilian photographs had been taken. Wilcox said no. He would later say that after that call he felt as though someone was watching the office for several days. A black car parked across the street at odd hours. A man in a hat who came into the cafe next door but never ordered anything. He couldn't prove any of it, but he felt it, and that was enough. Then came the biggest moment of all, the press release. Issued by the public information officer at the base, it was a bombshell in every sense of the word. The military had recovered a flying disc, the release read. That phrasing wasn't accidental. It came straight from the top. The release was issued to local papers, then passed to national wire services. Within hours, the story was everywhere. RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. Wilcox stared at the headline like a man staring at a snake in his boot. That's not what they told me they were going to say, he thought. It was true. Something had been recovered. But calling it a flying saucer, that was a provocation, a beacon, and it wouldn't be long before the military reeled it back in. The very next day, the official story changed. The object wasn't a disc, it was a weather balloon, just a simple, misidentified piece of meteorological equipment. Wilcox watched as the narrative folded in on itself, like one of Mac Brazel's pieces of foil. The wreckage disappeared, spirited away to Fort Worth, and eventually to silence. The media coverage softened. The town moved on, but Wilcox never did. In the years that followed, he would speak of it only rarely and never to reporters. He told friends it had been the strangest week of his life. He told his wife that something wasn't right, that the military had taken something they couldn't explain and buried it under paperwork, that the real story would never be told. He retired a few years later, died not long after, and when they cleared out his desk, there was no folder, no photos, nothing but a single sentence scratched on the back of an old receipt, tucked into the back of a drawer. It wasn't a balloon. That's all he left behind. But for a man like George Wilcox, who never wasted words, it was enough. The Roswell Army Airfield sat just outside of town, quietly sprawled across the desert like a sleeping metal animal. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. It was built for function, not pride. Runways like scars across the sand, hangars yawning open to the sun, barracks where the air was always dry and the bunks never quite comfortable. It was the home of the 509th Bomb Group, the only unit in the world that had ever dropped an atomic bomb in combat. The ghosts of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just memories here. They were embedded in the concrete, etched in every salute and every tightly folded bedsheet. This was not a place where things went unnoticed, so when Major Jesse Marcel returned to base with a jeep full of wreckage, odd metals, flexible rods, heat-defiant foil, and artifacts bearing what looked like alien script, it did not go unnoticed. He arrived in the dead of night, headlights cutting across the tarmac, dust rising behind him like the tail of a comet. The guards at the gate barely looked twice at him. They didn't need to. His clearance, his reputation, his face, they all spoke louder than any clipboard. But the contents of his jeep were another matter. He drove directly to the intelligence offices and requested a secure space to store the material. No paperwork, no questions, just that particular brand of military language that makes a command sound like a suggestion, and a suggestion sound like a wall. Within the hour, a private room was cleared. Marcel, now visibly agitated despite his usual composure, began unloading the wreckage piece by piece. The soldiers assigned to assist him were told nothing, and they asked less. But every now and then, a glance passed between them, one of those nervous, conspiratorial looks that says, "I'm not supposed to understand this, and that's the part that scares me." Some of the fragments looked like components, functional, maybe even technological. Others looked ornamental or structural. But all of it had one thing in common. It didn't fit into any known category of military debris. Marcel had seen the wreckage of planes. He'd seen the jagged aftermath of training missions gone wrong, balloons torn open across mountains, drones that had crashed mid-test. This was not any of that. He held one of the rods up to the light. It didn't shine. It resisted light. Absorbed it somehow. It wasn't black. Not exactly. It was anti-light. Its edges felt smooth, but not machined. Like it had never been manufactured so much as willed into existence. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he filed an internal report, one he knew would never be publicly acknowledged, and requested a meeting with Colonel William Blanchard, the base's commanding officer. Blanchard read the report slowly, eyebrows knitting tighter with each paragraph. He asked questions. Marcel answered with precision but avoided speculation. He gave the facts, or at least the pieces of them he could verify. There was a crash. The debris was unlike anything in US inventory. The materials resisted classification. The symbols on the beams were undecipherable. No crew or bodies had been found yet. Blanchard didn't say much. Instead, he issued orders. First, the site was to be secured. A retrieval team was dispatched to the Foster Ranch with instructions to collect every scrap of material still on the ground. Civilians were to be kept out. If anyone asked, they were conducting a weather balloon recovery. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. Second, the debris in Marcel's possession was to be flown immediately to Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas, where it could be examined by Brigadier General Roger Ramey. Third, a press release. This is the moment that changed everything. It's often said that it was a slip-up, that some overeager officer pushed the saucer angle too hard. But those who were there tell a different story, that Blanchard himself authorized the release, that it was written deliberately, that it was a test of public reaction, of media interest, or perhaps of internal loyalty. The release was brief, clean, carefully worded yet explosive. The many rumours regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday, when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the sheriff's office of Chaves County. That was all, but it was enough. The Associated Press picked it up within hours. It ran on local and national wires. Newspapers across the country printed versions of the same headline: RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. Phones at the base lit up like a switchboard in a thunderstorm. Reporters, editors, military liaisons, senators' offices, the Pentagon. The Air Force had just declared that they'd recovered a flying disc, and now they had to decide whether to double down or walk it back. Behind the scenes, there was chaos. Blanchard was summoned for a call with higher-ups. Marcel was told to prepare for travel. The debris was packed into crates, some of them mismatched, borrowed from other shipments, and loaded onto a B-29. It took off under high security, bound for Fort Worth. Back at Roswell, the retrieval teams had arrived at the Foster Ranch. They weren't gentle. Civilians were told to stay inside, roads were blocked off. Soldiers moved across the field with metal detectors and canvas sacks, gathering every sliver of the unknown. Some pieces were photographed, others were simply collected and locked away. Mac Brazel, now suddenly the centre of something far beyond his understanding, was brought in for further questioning. He would stay under supervision for several days, not imprisoned, but not exactly free either. His story would change, or rather, it would be changed. Within 24 hours of the press release, a new statement was issued. The object was not a flying disc. It was a weather balloon, nothing more. A case of mistaken identity. The public was asked to move along, but at the base not everyone was so sure. Soldiers whispered in the mess hall. Some claimed to have seen the material before it vanished into crates. Others said they'd helped move boxes marked with classifications higher than anything they'd ever encountered. A few swore, only in hushed tones, never in daylight, that there had been a second sight, that not everything had been recovered from the first field, that something else, larger, stranger, had come down nearby, that bodies had been seen, small ones. These rumours never made it into official reports, but they lived on in footnotes, in family stories, in barroom whispers, and over time they would outlast the records themselves. At the Roswell Army Airfield, life resumed its usual rhythm: marches, inspections, training flights. But something had changed, not just because something had crashed, because something had been covered up, and whether it was for national security, for Cold War secrecy, or to protect against a truth too big to handle, it left a scar, a silence, a new kind of fear, the kind that doesn't come from seeing something terrifying, the kind that comes from realizing the truth might be locked in a file you'll never be allowed to read. History does not always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it sneaks in through a press office, wearing a bland expression and holding a single sheet of paper. And on July 8th, 1947, history came dressed in army olive, typing quietly in the corner of Building 84 at the Roswell Army Airfield. The man doing the typing was First Lieutenant Walter Haut, the base's public information officer. He wasn't a conspiracy theorist or a secret keeper. He was, quite literally, the middleman, an officer whose job was to hand out softball press releases about training exercises and morale events. If someone set a record, he'd write the press release. If someone's kid sold the most war bonds in their school district, he'd write about that too. He was not, by any stretch of imagination, supposed to be the mouthpiece for the biggest mystery in modern American history. But that morning he was handed a message from Colonel William Blanchard. It wasn't wordy, it didn't include context, just a few sharp lines with the precision of a scalpel. Haut read it once, then again, squinting as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. They didn't. The message read as follows. The many rumours regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the sheriff's office of Chaves County. That was it. That was all. No details, no pictures, just the calm, confident language of a statement that would go on to fuel decades of debate, obsession, and cinematic inspiration. A single, unassuming release that would launch 1,000 documentaries and at least 2 Mulder and Scully spin-offs. It was typed up cleanly. No flair, no metaphors, not even a date at the top. Just the words and the authority of a base that had been the cradle of nuclear might. Haut blinked. Then he picked up the phone and called the Roswell Daily Record. Over at the newspaper, the newsroom was in its usual summer torpor. It was July. The heat pressed against the windows like an accusation. The paper was thin that day, some local gossip, a story about water rationing, and a national wire piece about the possibility of fuel shortages. Nothing exciting, nothing otherworldly. Until the phone rang, Haut, always professional, read the statement over the phone in his clipped military tone. The reporter on the other end, Frank Joyce, didn't quite know what to make of it. He asked Haut to repeat it. He did. The words landed like sandbags. Flying disc, recovered, Army Airfield, local rancher. Joyce scribbled furiously, asked a few clarifying questions, then put down the receiver and stared at his notes. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't science fiction. This was military. The most secretive, powerful, and sober institution in the country was telling him, on the record, that they had recovered a flying disc. Not seen one, not chased one. Recovered. Within the hour, the Roswell Daily Record had their front page lead. RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. They printed it in bold block letters. It screamed from newsstands, telephone poles, and cafe countertops. A photo of Major Marcel accompanied the piece. Not looking panicked, not looking amused. Just serious. Professional. As if this was all perfectly standard procedure. But it wasn't, and everyone knew it. Wire services picked up the story. Within 12 hours, the news had spread across the United States and overseas. Newspaper editors from Boston to Los Angeles scrambled to reprint the release, barely bothering to contextualize it. The story moved so fast that the usual media gears didn't have time to grind, and for a few hours, just a few, America stood still. Because here was something new. Not war, not politics, not crime, but the possibility of something beyond us. A disc from the sky. Recovered, held, inspected, by men in uniforms. It wasn't some farmer's tall tale. It wasn't a blurry photo. It was the US Army Air Forces themselves saying, yes, something is here. For those few hours, the imagination of a nation exploded. Radio hosts speculated. Late editions ran reprints. Telephones in Roswell rang incessantly. Reporters flooded the town. Some drove from Albuquerque or Amarillo. Others booked flights from New York or San Francisco. And they didn't come asking if something had been found. They came to see what. At the Foster Ranch, soldiers had already swept the area. The debris was gone. The site had been picked clean. Mac Brazel was no longer taking interviews. His answers were quiet, short, practiced. Just a weather balloon, he told them. Just some tinfoil and sticks. His voice lacked conviction. Over at the base, Marcel was gone, flown to Fort Worth, wreckage in tow. Colonel Blanchard had mysteriously taken leave. Haut, the man who had issued the press release, was suddenly cagey. His phone calls were being screened. And then came the reversal. It didn't come from Roswell, it came from Fort Worth, from Brigadier General Roger Ramey. He called a press conference, invited the media. And then, standing in a room filled with photographers and typewriters, he smiled and held up a crumpled piece of mylar balloon and some balsa wood struts. This, he said, is what we found. He pointed to a man beside him, Major Marcel, now photographed holding the debris with a look that can only be described as resigned. The same man who had recovered the wreckage from the ranch. The same man who, days later, would tell his son in hushed tones, "That's not what I found. That's not what I brought in." But the damage, or the repair, depending on your perspective, had been done. The flying disc was now a weather balloon. The headlines softened. The story receded. Editors rolled their eyes. Some readers muttered about miscommunication. Others nodded sagely and chalked it up to Cold War nerves. But not everyone bought it. Not in Roswell, not in the ranchlands, and not in the homes where readers had stared at the bold type of that first press release and felt something stir inside them. Something ancient. Something curious. That press release, just a few lines, was never retracted. It was simply replaced, buried under bureaucracy, smothered with explanations, but it lingered, like a spark in dry grass. Years later, Walter Haut would tell people, off the record, that he always suspected there was more to the story. That Blanchard had known exactly what he was doing when he told him to issue the release, that there were meetings he hadn't been invited to, that he had seen more than he was allowed to describe. In 2002, near the end of his life, Haut signed an affidavit. In it, he claimed that he had seen the wreckage, that he had seen bodies, small, strange bodies under sheets, that a craft had been stored in Hangar 84, that a cover-up had taken shape before his eyes, that affidavit wouldn't be released until after his death. But the press release, it had never died. It had simply become legend. There's a peculiar stillness in the moment a lie is born, not the kind that stammers or fumbles or blinks too much, but the kind that slips out smooth and practiced, like it had always been waiting to be said. The kind that's not spoken with malice, but with resolve. A lie that isn't just a lie, but a shield, a line in the sand, a closing of the door. In the days following the now legendary Roswell press release, that kind of lie began to take root, not as a single utterance, but as a structure, a scaffolding of silence and plausible deniability. What began as a curious incident in a dusty New Mexico field began to warp into something heavier, something orchestrated, something covered. Let's start with the military. When the initial press release rocketed across newswires and electrified imaginations from Seattle to Staten Island, there was a brief flicker, just a few hours, when the story was alive in the open air. People read about a flying disc. They read that it had been recovered, that the Army Air Forces had it in custody. They read, maybe with a cold thrill, that it wasn't a rumour anymore, that it had happened. And then, like a magician snapping his fingers, everything changed. The curtain fell. The disc was now officially a weather balloon. No further details would be provided. Colonel Blanchard, who had authorised the original statement, was now mysteriously on leave. Major Marcel, who had been photographed examining the wreckage, was now standing stiffly beside a table full of weather balloon parts in Fort Worth, saying things that didn't quite line up with what he'd said the day before. The media, hungry for sensation but short on persistence, followed the new lead. The real story was buried under wire photos of balsa wood and rubber. Editorials mused about public hysteria. Military spokesmen issued short, rehearsed statements. And in Roswell, people stopped talking. Not because they weren't curious, because they were afraid. Witnesses were visited, farmers, deputies, civilians who had seen the wreckage up close, people who had driven near the ranch, or heard things on the base, or talked to people who had talked to people. Some were told directly, keep your mouth shut, for national security, for your own good. Others were reminded of what they'd signed when they joined up. Papers, oaths, loyalty acts. Others still were paid a visit by men who never gave names, only credentials, who asked questions, then asked more personal questions, then suggested gently that it might be better to forget what they thought they saw. And there's something uniquely chilling about being told, not that you're lying, but that you didn't see what you know you saw, that your memory has betrayed you, that your truth is dangerous. It makes the walls move in. The cover-up didn't arrive all at once. It settled in like a fog. Patchy at first, then thicker by the hour. Let's break it down. Not into bullet points, but into pressure points. First, there was the debris. Every fragment recovered from the Foster Ranch was packed up, boxed, and flown out of Roswell. Not to one destination, but to several. Fort Worth, Wright Field in Ohio, possibly even Los Alamos. Eyewitnesses remember heavy security, vehicles arriving under cover of night, hangars sealed off, equipment they didn't recognize. One man swore he saw the wreckage being loaded into an unmarked truck at 3 a.m., guarded by MPs with their weapons drawn, not against a threat, but against curiosity. Second, there were the photographs. The famous one, the one of Major Marcel with the balloon wreckage, was taken by reporters at Fort Worth Army Airfield. But other photos, the ones possibly taken on site, gone. No one could produce them. If any had been snapped by base personnel or civilians, they were never published. In fact, some Roswell locals would later claim that their film had been confiscated. A man named Dennis, last name redacted in early reports, said he'd tried to take a photo of the cleanup operation. The next day, 2 officers came to his house. One of them had his camera, they said it. Was being held for evidence. It was never returned. Third, the language. In every subsequent statement made by military officials, the tone shifted from curiosity to finality. No more investigation, no more speculation. The matter was closed. Brigadier General Ramey, during the infamous press conference in Fort Worth, leaned heavily on the idea of misidentification. People just don't know what weather balloons look like, he said. When asked about the unusual material, he shrugged. Common stuff. When someone brought up the hieroglyphs, reported by Marcel and others, Ramey said nothing. Silence is an answer too. Fourth, the redirection. Not all cover-ups involve destroying evidence. Some simply drown it in other noise. Over the next few weeks, Roswell began to disappear from the news cycle. There were new stories to chase. Cold War tension in Eastern Europe, strikes at home, Truman's economic reforms. The newspapers moved on and so did the public, at least most of it. But in Roswell, the story couldn't die, because people remembered what they'd seen. Mac Brazel, the man at the centre of it all, emerged from his stint with the military looking subdued and unsure. He was no longer describing exotic debris. Now he spoke in muted tones, talking about rubber and sticks and tinfoil. His statements sounded coached, hollow, rehearsed. He told one reporter that he wished he'd never said anything, and maybe he meant it. Maybe, under the weight of it all, he truly wanted it to go away. Or maybe that's what he was told to say. Decades later, his family would suggest the latter. But the deepest layer of the cover-up wasn't military. It wasn't orders or censorship. It was psychological. Because the best way to erase a truth isn't to destroy it. It's to discredit it, to surround it with noise, to associate it with instability. That's what happened next. The term flying saucer became a punchline. The witnesses, farmers, officers, nurses, radio operators were slowly recast in the public imagination as cranks. Little green men became shorthand for nonsense. UFOs became the territory of fantasists. Hollywood helped with that, churning out B-movies filled with absurd costumes and melodramatic aliens. And with every flying saucer that zoomed across a movie screen, the idea of an actual crash in Roswell became just a little bit more ridiculous. That's how the cover-up lasted. Not because no one knew the truth, but because people learned to laugh at it. He didn't look like a man who had seen something extraordinary. Major Jesse Antoine Marcel had the kind of face that got out of the way of things, strong-jawed, serious and unremarkable in a way that made him the perfect man for secrets. Not flashy, not mysterious, just competent. And in 1947, that was enough. In the US Army Air Forces, men like Jesse Marcel weren't supposed to raise eyebrows. They were supposed to follow orders, catalogue debris, write reports, handle intelligence quietly and efficiently and leave no trace. But Jesse Marcel saw something, and what he saw would stay with him, not in a sensational way, not as trauma or thrill, but as a weight, a contradiction, a secret wedged between obligation and reality, growing heavier with each year he kept it quiet. When Marcel was dispatched to the Foster Ranch by Colonel Blanchard, he didn't expect anything remarkable. The call from Sheriff Wilcox had suggested some sort of aircraft wreckage, maybe a balloon, maybe a glider, something that had come down in the storm. Routine, probably, but orders were orders. He arrived at the ranch in a military jeep, dressed in his field uniform, ready to collect whatever odds and ends the locals had dragged out of the scrub. Mac Brazel was waiting, laconic, grim-faced, his truck already half-loaded with the mystery. Marcel expected a few fragments. What he found was a field, a debris field, stretching over nearly a mile of ranch land, scattered with materials unlike anything in his experience. And this wasn't a greenhorn talking. Marcel had been in intelligence for years. He'd handled wreckage from Japanese Zeros, American B-29s, German buzz bombs. He knew what crash technology looked like. This wasn't that. The materials were baffling, some impossibly light, some razor-thin but resistant to all bending or creasing. One piece he tried to damage with a pocket knife. Nothing. Another he attempted to burn. The flame curled, licked, and died without leaving a mark. There were beams, smooth and uniform with symbols that seemed neither ornamental nor functional, just other. Not in any earthly alphabet, not even in a known code. These were shapes that suggested a language, but not one meant for human eyes. Marcel walked the field slowly, piece by piece. He wasn't prone to flights of fancy, but even he had to admit, this wasn't from any aircraft known to him, nor any balloon, rocket, or weather device. He thought about classified tech, secret projects, maybe Soviet, maybe experimental, but nothing fit. The next morning he loaded the most interesting pieces into his jeep and drove back toward Roswell. And here, the story splits again. Because according to Jesse Marcel, speaking many years later, he made a stop. Not at the base, not yet, but at his own home. He wanted his family to see it. His wife was asleep, but his son, Jesse Jr., 11 years old, was awake. Marcel laid the debris out on the kitchen floor. Let the boy examine the material. Let him hold the metal that returned to shape. Let him trace his fingers across the strange violet symbols. "Son," he reportedly said, "you'll never see anything like this again." And then he left. Took the debris to the base, filed the report, followed orders, and somewhere along the line the narrative changed. Marcel was ordered to Fort Worth. There, he met with Brigadier General Roger Ramey, who told him that what he had recovered was not a flying disc but a weather balloon. And that's what they would be telling the press. Marcel did not argue. He stood beside Ramey as they laid out parts from a real balloon, rubber, sticks, foil, struts, and posed for photographs. The debris looked nothing like what Marcel had recovered. He knew it. Ramey knew it. But Marcel said nothing, because that's what was expected. He returned to Roswell, kept quiet, continued his service. And the story faded. Years passed, then decades. Jesse Marcel moved on in rank and duty, but something stuck with him, something he could not scrub away. And in the 1970s, when the world began to take a new interest in Roswell, when authors and researchers came knocking, Marcel did something no one expected. He told the truth, or at least his truth. He gave interviews. He spoke to investigators. He told them calmly, without drama, that the material recovered on the Foster Ranch was not of this earth, not from any country, not from any military. And not, he insisted, from a balloon. He talked about the strange weightlessness of the metal, the way it refused to burn or break, the beams with symbols, the size of the debris field. He described how the official story had changed overnight, how he had been told to pose with unrelated materials, how none of it made sense, and the world listened. Because here was a military man, an intelligence officer from the 509th, saying, on the record, that the Roswell crash had been something other, something unexplainable. Skeptics tried to paint him as old, confused, chasing attention. But the facts didn't change. He hadn't tried to publish a book. He didn't claim to see aliens. He simply described what he'd handled, what he'd brought home, what he'd been told not to talk about. His son, Jesse Marcel Jr., confirmed the story, said he remembered the foil, the rods, the symbols, said he never forgot the look on his father's face, half proud, half afraid. Over the years, Marcel's quiet insistence became one of the few consistent threads in the tangled knot of Roswell accounts. He didn't embellish, didn't contradict himself. He just said what he'd always known. It wasn't a weather balloon. Before his death in 1986, Jesse Marcel gave one final interview. He looked tired, not in the way of a man who lacked sleep, but in the way of a man who had carried something for far too long. "I know what I saw," he said. He paused, looked off camera, and it wasn't from this planet. When the national news cycle moved on, it didn't do so with any formal announcement or grand gesture. There was no redirection campaign, no fiery rebuttal from officials, no midnight revelation to stamp out curiosity. It simply drifted away, as if the story had been a momentary glitch, something that had slipped through the cracks and embarrassed those who had allowed it. The headlines that once declared the recovery of a flying disc were quietly displaced by more pedestrian concerns, economic reports, regional weather disruptions, the ongoing reshaping of post-war Europe. The Roswell incident, for all its jarring implications, was flattened into background noise. But in Roswell itself, that flattening didn't feel like relief. It felt like compression. Like the town had been wrapped in gauze, the air filtered through some unseen screen. At first, there was an air of suspended animation. People weren't just confused, they were cautious. Conversations, once free-flowing and gossip-laced, developed an edge. Volume dropped, eye contact lingered. Questions were met with changes in subject or clipped replies. The crash was something everyone had heard about, and many had seen signs of, but the aftermath made it increasingly clear that this was not a story to be repeated lightly. Whatever had happened out on the Foster Ranch, and whatever had been carted off by military personnel, had now been bundled into a narrative none of the locals had written. It hadn't taken legislation, or arrests, or force. It had just taken pressure. A slow, ambient pressure that made people ask themselves what they were willing to risk by continuing to speak. There was no formal declaration of silence, no "shut it down" broadcast. But you could feel it. It was in the way Sheriff Wilcox gave shorter and shorter interviews until he stopped talking altogether. It was in Mac Brazel's recitation of new lines, lines that bore the unmistakable fingerprints of rehearsal. It was in the increasingly awkward behaviour of those who'd seen the wreckage up close and were now saying they'd misremembered. More than anything, it was in the ordinary places where silence doesn't usually live. Barbershops, church pews, front porches. Even the newspaper office seemed to develop a tension in the air, like the paper itself had grown aware of its boundaries. Children began to sense it too. Their parents grew strange when the topic came up. Adults who normally treated local rumours with dry amusement suddenly became serious, even nervous when asked about the disc. Boys and girls who'd once swapped exaggerated stories about what crashed out there found themselves hushed mid-sentence. Over time, the stories themselves started to fade, not just from lack of interest, but from a gradual internalised belief that remembering them was somehow improper, or worse, unsafe. The town took on the characteristics of a place that had seen a ghost and was trying to forget it. Main Street was still lined with businesses. People still shopped for groceries and lingered over coffee. But underneath the normal rhythm of life was a peculiar vigilance. You could see it in the subtle way conversation swerved away from the event, as if by muscle memory. You could hear it in the way locals described the crash, if they spoke of it at all, with a vagueness that betrayed just how much they were leaving unsaid. The military, of course, had gone silent. After the press conference in Fort Worth, after the weather balloon explanation had been printed and reprinted, the official channel stopped issuing anything at all. The matter was considered closed. Files were shuffled into folders, hangars were sealed, crates were moved off-site. The press, largely satisfied with the revised narrative, moved on. But the military presence in Roswell didn't disappear. It simply recalibrated. There were more personnel around town than usual, more uniformed men in unmarked vehicles, more strangers lingering just long enough to take notes, then vanishing back to wherever they came from. Over time, Roswell began to exist in two layers. On the surface, it was a ranching town in New Mexico, with a modest population and a proud, practical culture. Beneath that surface was something else entirely, a dense network of quiet knowledge, tentative recollections, and stories that never made it into print. Locals still talked, but rarely in public, and even more rarely with outsiders. Those who'd seen the debris with their own eyes, or had heard something firsthand, often stopped discussing it altogether. When they did speak, it was in kitchens, over coffee, with the radio turned up just loud enough to mask the words. The people who tried to keep the story alive, journalists, investigators, even a few curious scientists, ran into brick walls. One local librarian, fascinated by the implications of the crash, began collecting personal accounts in the late 1950s. Within a few months she stopped. Her notes had been misplaced repeatedly. Some of her witnesses refused to talk after being visited by men she described as not from around here. A schoolteacher who brought up the event during a class on current events was pulled aside after hours and discouraged, gently but firmly, from discussing it again. She was transferred to another district before the year ended. Then there were the stories that refused to go away, even in whispers. A nurse at the base hospital, they said, had made a remark to a friend about seeing something small under a sheet, something with eyes too wide and limbs too thin. She disappeared not long after. No records of her reassignment were found. A janitor claimed to have seen something wheeled into Hangar 84 under an impossibly tight tarp, guarded by armed MPs. He mentioned it once to a friend, then never again. Another young man, working as a gas station attendant, said he overheard two officers talking about how it wasn't Russian, and it sure as hell wasn't ours. He shared the story at a poker game. Within weeks he stopped coming to town events. These weren't formal disappearances. No one vanished in the night. No files were publicly redacted, but people went quiet, moved away, declined interviews. Some changed their minds midway through a sentence. Others aged into silence, choosing peace over explanation. And then, for a long time, nothing. The town didn't forget. It simply learned how to avoid remembering. By the time the 1960s rolled in, the crash was little more than a legend. Something folded into the long history of American oddities. The occasional article or half-hearted radio segment might revive it for a moment, but the town had learned its lesson. Truth, or whatever lay closest to it, didn't belong to them anymore. It belonged to something else. A different Roswell would re-emerge in the 1970s, brighter, louder, full of questions and conferences and theories. But that would come later. For now, the Roswell of the late 40s and 50s belonged to silence. Not peaceful silence, but the heavy kind. The kind that hums in your bones. The kind that tells you a story has ended, even though none of the chapters ever really made sense. For all the things recovered at the Foster Ranch, beams with strange symbols, filament that wouldn't break, unidentifiable structures both rigid and light. It was the foil that refused to be forgotten. Witnesses would speak of it in hushed, reverent tones, not because it was dangerous or beautiful, but because it defied categorization. In a world of things that could be named, catalogued, and filed away, this was the one piece that refused to stay in any folder. It wasn't just alien in origin, it was alien in behavior. A sheet of confusion, a whisper from somewhere else. It was metallic in appearance. Flat, silver, thin as paper, but impossible to crease. It shimmered slightly in light, but gave off no reflection. It didn't feel like aluminum or tin. It didn't feel like anything, really. It was as though you were touching the idea of a metal, the concept of foil, rather than any earthly variant. When folded, it resisted. When crumpled, it uncrumpled, smoothly, perfectly, as if untouched. Over and over again, Witnesses would try to describe what it felt like, and over again the words would fail them. Like nothing I've ever seen, they'd say, like it wanted to remember itself. Hence the name, memory metal, a poetic term, not a scientific one. But even scientists would later adopt it, because no term in their lexicon could explain the material better. It was as if the foil had intention. Not intelligence, not thought, but intent. It wanted to return to its shape. It wanted to lie flat. It wanted, for lack of a better word, to persist. Jesse Marcel, both senior and junior, would recall it in vivid detail. Jesse Jr., just 11 years old at the time, remembered his father laying the pieces out on the kitchen floor, the strangeness of them glowing faintly beneath the flickering bulb overhead. There was excitement in his father's voice, not fear, but curiosity, and a quiet urgency that suggested this was not something to forget. Jesse Jr. would touch the metal, twist it, press it into his palms, and watch it return to form. Years later, he would describe it with a calm certainty that unsettled even the most skeptical interviewers. It was not from here, he would say, and not once would he hedge or soften that declaration. Other witnesses, soldiers, locals, even base technicians who handled the material briefly before it was crated away, told the same story. The foil defied scissors, fire, hammers. It resisted pressure. One technician reportedly hit it with a rubber mallet on a workbench and watched it vibrate, not dent. Another attempted to slice it with a blade and left no mark. And yet it was weightless, flexible. You could fold it like a handkerchief if you wanted, but the moment you let it go, it would drift back to flatness like a leaf floating to the ground. Some described how it seemed to float slightly in the air if dropped, not quite like paper or ash, but as if slowed by something invisible. Others noticed how it stayed cool to the touch, even after being held or exposed to the desert sun. It didn't conduct heat the way metal should. It didn't hold fingerprints. One soldier said that even when he rubbed it vigorously between his palms, it never grew warm, never smudged. There are stories, unconfirmed but persistent, of scientists at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base attempting to reverse engineer the foil. Some say they tried for years, that it was the basis for entire research programs. That attempts to replicate it led nowhere, that eventually the material was locked away in a vault and forgotten or worse, reclassified under something so buried in the labyrinth of government secrecy that even the janitors needed clearances just to empty the trash nearby. Skeptics, of course, have their explanations. They suggest that the material was nothing more than mylar, an early plastic developed for military use, or radar reflector foil perhaps. They point to Project Mogul, the high-altitude balloon initiative that used lightweight materials to hoist sensitive listening equipment into the upper atmosphere. But even mylar has limits. It crinkles, it melts. It does not, under any circumstance, return to its shape with the eerie, self-healing consistency reported by dozens of witnesses. Moreover, the Project Mogul explanation relies on the idea that multiple people, including trained military personnel, mistook common balloon parts for something exotic. That Marcel, an intelligence officer for the only nuclear-capable unit in the world, lacked the experience to recognize foil, sticks, and tape. That even after transporting the material, filing his report and flying it to Fort Worth, he never once paused and said, "Oh, that's just balloon stuff." It strains belief. And it asks us to ignore something essential, that the most haunting mysteries aren't defined by grand displays, but by small contradictions. A material that resists all classification. That appears simple but behaves impossibly. That lies flat in your hand but feels like it contains a secret too big to tell. Even now, decades later, the memory metal remains one of the most persistent threads in the Roswell tapestry. Researchers still seek it. Some claim to have found traces of something similar in private labs or foreign archives. Others believe it was shipped to secret facilities and absorbed into black budget programs. There are whispers of breakthroughs, of shape memory alloys that may have been inspired by the Roswell foil, but none of those resemble the accounts from 1947. None of them quite match the magic, and magic is the only word left when science gives you a shrug. In some ways, the memory metal became a stand-in for the whole incident, a single piece that contained all the contradictions. It was something that couldn't be from here, but that was now, irrevocably, here. Something light enough to carry, but heavy enough to change your life. It sat in pockets, on desks, in drawers, before it vanished behind military fences. And in the years that followed, People didn't just remember the crash, they remembered the feel of it, the weightless shimmer, the way it made you doubt your own touch. It is possible, of course, that all of it was mundane, that the memory metal was some experimental product misinterpreted by frightened civilians and overworked soldiers, that it was a case of collective misremembering, where awe inflated the ordinary into the impossible. But if that's true, it's strange how consistent the awe was, how uniform the confusion, how every account, from ranchers to officers to children, all described the same sensation, not of fear, not of danger, but of wonder, as though the foil had carried something with it, not a message, not a threat, but an invitation to notice, to ask. And maybe that's why it was so dangerous, because it didn't need a signature, it didn't need to say where it came from. All it needed to do was lie there on the floor, return to its shape, and whisper, "You don't know everything you think you know." In a town as small as Roswell was in 1947, children were everywhere, underfoot in the general store, running barefoot between fence posts dangling from oak trees at the edge of town, and chasing each other down the long dry roads that curled through the outskirts of ranchland. They heard everything, these children. They were too small to understand jurisdiction, too honest for subterfuge, too curious to know when they should have been looking away. And in the days before the military arrived in force, before the official explanations settled like dust over the wreckage, it was often children who encountered pieces of the truth first, those sharp, glittering fragments not just of foil and rods, but of the unbelievable. They weren't supposed to be there. No one took their testimonies seriously at the time. Reporters rarely asked them for details, and even when they spoke up, their stories were filtered through the familiar adult lens of exaggeration, confusion, or attention-seeking. But children, for all their embellishments and flights of fancy, are far less interested in consistency than they are in clarity. And when you read or listen to what the children of Roswell said, years later, often decades later, you don't find polished narratives. You find blunt honesty, shaped not by belief or skepticism, but by the persistent echo of memory. There was a boy named Greg, 9 years old, who had wandered the edge of the Foster Ranch with his older cousin, days before the army cordoned it off. He remembered spotting something shiny on the ridge, something that didn't belong there, catching the sun like a signal. They climbed the hill, expecting to find a broken bottle or maybe a piece of a downed plane, but what they found instead was a strip of something flat and silver, cold even in the heat. Greg remembered pressing it between his fingers, crumpling it into a ball like candy wrapper, only to watch it unfurl in his hand like a trick flower. He told his parents. They told him to stay quiet, that he hadn't seen anything, that it was just part of a balloon, but years later he still remembered the way it moved. Not like metal, not like fabric, but like memory. A girl named Louise, 12 at the time, lived near the edge of town, close enough to see the trucks rolling by. She said she watched one afternoon as a line of military vehicles passed her family's farm gate. Not strange in itself, there was always activity near the base, but what struck her was how fast they moved. Not fast as in speeding, but fast as in urgent, without the usual stopping, without the idle chatter of soldiers who'd been assigned a boring detail. They didn't wave, they didn't look at her. And in the back of one of the trucks, through a loose flap in the canvas, she swore she saw something metallic. Not a box, not equipment, but a shape, a curve, something domed and reflective. She told no one until she was an adult. Many children told stories like this. Some mentioned seeing uniformed men digging or collecting objects in the dirt before anyone knew to put up fences. Others recalled their parents having whispered conversations late at night, the kind where one voice insists and the other hushes. Some children said they saw things that sounded possible, objects in the sky that moved too fast to track, lights that flickered and hovered before disappearing in silence. Strange men, not in uniform, but with a kind of authority that made their presence unquestioned. Not all these stories can be verified. Not all were consistent, but neither are memories of adults, especially when trauma or confusion or pressure is involved. What's striking is not that the children disagreed. What's striking is how much they agreed, without ever having talked to one another. Perhaps the most well-known account from this overlooked demographic is that of Denise Chavez, who was just 7 years old at the time. Her father worked maintenance at the base, and while she didn't know the details of his job, she remembered his change in behaviour after the crash. He was a quiet man, but after July 1947, he became a silent one. Denise remembered coming into the living room one afternoon to find her father sitting in his chair, staring at his hands as though they were foreign. He didn't notice her. Her mother whispered later, "Your father saw something he wasn't meant to." Denise wouldn't learn what that meant until she was older, when her father, after years of not talking, began in his old age to mutter at the kitchen table about bodies small enough to carry two at a time and eyes that don't blink. Denise herself would later recall being taken to a base picnic in late July. The children were told not to wander. She wandered. Behind one of the hangars, she saw a group of men unloading something from a long, low truck. They worked in silence, as if sound itself was being discouraged. She didn't know what it was she saw. Just a canvas bundle, shaped wrong for gear, too smooth and curved in places where people are not. She said the moment one of the men spotted her, he didn't yell. He didn't scold. He simply walked toward her, took her by the shoulders, and said very softly, "You shouldn't be here." She never told her parents. She didn't think they'd believe her, but she never forgot the tone of the man's voice, less angry than afraid. Even the children who weren't close to the wreckage remembered the shift in the town itself. A boy named Howard, 10 at the time, described how school at Full felt different. Not because anything overt had changed, but because the adults around him seemed preoccupied. Teachers paused too long between sentences. The principal patrolled the halls more often. There was a strange sense, he said, of being watched, but not by each other, by something above them. He didn't mean that in a science fiction way. He meant it like a social pressure, like the grown-ups had seen behind a curtain and whatever was back there had unsettled them. It's easy, of course, to dismiss these accounts. Children exaggerate, children misremember. But one has to ask, why are their stories so similar? Why do they so often include the same few details, the same kind of metal, the same unease among the adults, the same feeling of something important being hidden just out of view? And why is it that when these children became adults, they didn't seek fame, didn't write books or launch careers in ufology? They just remembered, quietly, sometimes reluctantly. The truth is, children are often the first casualties of secrets. Not because they are directly harmed, but because they are forced to live in the emotional fallout of things never explained. In Roswell, the kids weren't given answers, they were given silence. And over the years, that silence calcified. It became normal. But the memories, those stayed fresh, clear. Not because they made sense, but because they didn't. And perhaps that is what gives their stories weight. Not the details, but the difficulty. The persistence of images that don't fit. The sense that something happened which has never been properly named. In the end, the children of Roswell were not consulted. They were not interviewed. They were not asked to draw what they saw. But they saw something. And decades later, when researchers finally started looking back through the layers of noise, it was the quietest voices that rang out with the most unsettling clarity. She never had a name in the official records, at least not one that could be traced. No personnel file, no discharge papers, no yearbook photograph of the medical corps. But to those who remember the incident, those who heard whispers from the inside or claim to have once stood in the orbit of the wreckage, she is one of the most haunting figures in the entire Roswell account. Not a soldier, not a scientist, just a nurse. A nurse who may have seen something she was never supposed to see. A nurse who, within days of the crash, vanished from the base and from history. Her story doesn't come from a government archive. It doesn't arrive neatly packaged with citations or official logs. Instead, it appears in the margins. Testimonies from others who were there, fragments passed between friends, second-hand accounts recorded in the back halves of taped interviews. Some say she was young, others remember her as older. A few describe red hair, others dark. But one thing remains consistent. She worked in the medical wing of the Roswell Army Airfield in the summer of 1947, and after the events surrounding the crash, she was never seen again. The most persistent version of her story comes from Glenn Dennis, a local mortician who, in 1947, was contracted to provide mortuary services for the base. He was young at the time, just 22, working at the Ballard Funeral Home. He later recounted that around the time of the crash, he received a call from the base asking about the availability of small hermetically sealed coffins. specifically ones that could accommodate bodies no more than 4 feet tall. The request was odd, not completely implausible, child casualties weren't unheard of, but it was strange enough to stick with him. Later that same day, Dennis claimed, he was asked about methods for preserving bodies that had been exposed to the elements. Again, not strange on its own, but the phrasing was clinical, calculated, as though the caller was more interested in chemical resilience than funeral arrangements. When Dennis pressed for details, he was told not to ask questions. He was told the matter was classified. Shortly after, Dennis drove to the base hospital to deliver some mortuary supplies. There in the hallway, he says he encountered a nurse he knew, a woman he'd spoken with many times, someone who worked closely with the medical officers and who had always been friendly in a quiet, steady kind of way. But on that day, she looked changed, pale, nervous, shaken in a way that ran deeper than fatigue. Dennis asked what was going on. The nurse looked around to make sure no one was watching, then ushered him into a side room, out of sight. What she said next would haunt him for the rest of his life. She told him that something had come in. Not wounded soldiers, not crash victims. Bodies, small, incomplete. Burned, possibly. Not human. The word she used, Dennis later said, was "not from here." She'd been called in to assist with an examination, and what she saw had unsettled her beyond anything she'd ever known. The anatomy was wrong. The heads were too large, the eyes too wide, the limbs too thin, too delicate. The skin she described was greyish and smooth, almost translucent. There had been 3 of them. One may have been alive, at least briefly. She didn't say what happened next, only that she had seen things she never wanted to see again. Dennis tried to process what she was telling him, tried to believe it, but he could see in her face that she believed it, and then, just as quickly, she urged him to leave. She said they shouldn't be seen talking. She told him to forget the conversation, and then she was gone. The next day, Dennis attempted to contact her at the hospital. He was told she had been transferred. When he asked where, the answer was vague. "Overseas," someone said. "Classified," said another. When he pressed, he was warned, gently but firmly, not to ask again. She was never seen in Roswell after that. No one could provide a forwarding address. No one at the base claimed to know what had happened to her. Years later, when Dennis was interviewed by UFO researchers, he gave them her supposed name, but no records could confirm her identity. The nurse had become a phantom. A woman remembered vividly by one man, corroborated by a few, and yet missing from every piece of paper that might have anchored her to time. Skeptics, of course, dismissed Dennis's account. They pointed to the lack of documentation, the absence of a full name, the inconsistency of memories decades old. They suggested that Dennis, eager to contribute to a growing legend, had embellished a mundane interaction, or conjured the entire tale from nothing. But Dennis never seemed to chase the spotlight. He spoke quietly, reluctantly. He didn't sell his story to tabloids. He didn't appear on late-night radio. And to his dying day, he never retracted a word. Other witnesses later came forward to say they'd heard similar stories about a nurse. Some remembered a woman at the hospital who had been visibly distressed in the days after the crash. One airman said she had broken down in the mess hall, sobbing quietly into her tray before being led away by an officer. A different source claimed he'd seen her boarding a military transport plane under armed escort, her face expressionless, her eyes red. No one ever confirmed these sightings, but no one could refute them either, and so the nurse at the base hospital became one of Roswell's most enduring mysteries, a character without a history, a voice without a face. She represents, perhaps better than anyone else, the human cost of the cover-up, not in terms of trauma, necessarily, but in terms of erasure. Someone who bore witness to the unexplainable, who tried to tell just one person, and who was promptly vanished from the official story. Not eliminated, but absorbed, transferred, buried beneath the machinery of classification. There's something uniquely heartbreaking about her story, even among all the strange and sensational claims orbiting the Roswell case. Because hers isn't a story of grand revelation or cosmic insight. It's a story of someone just doing her job, called into a room, asked to help, and then quietly unmade by what she saw. Not because it hurt her, not because she was a threat, but because, in the language of military secrecy, she had become a variable, an anomaly, something that needed to be removed from the equation to keep the numbers tidy. To this day, there are those who claim they're still looking for her, that they've found old photos of the base's medical staff, cross-referenced rosters, chased down family names. Some believe she was given a new identity. Others think she may have spoken again, once perhaps, under another name, in a nursing home or on a back porch late at night, to someone she trusted. But if she did, those words have never surfaced. And maybe that's the final tragedy of Roswell, that even the people who tried to tell the truth weren't given the dignity of a name. In most crash sites, the question of what or who was recovered isn't the story. It's a footnote, a grim detail, a fact to be listed in a report and sealed in a drawer. But in Roswell, it is the story. Not just what came down, or how it moved, or what it was made of, but whether lying among the debris and the desert dust there were bodies. And if there were, what kind? The testimonies are scattered across decades, appearing in interviews, affidavits, memoirs, whispers. Some came from civilians, others from base personnel. Most were anonymous at first, later going public when they felt safe or brave enough. And though the details vary, they orbit a consistent, troubling nucleus. Something was recovered from the crash site that was not metallic, not mechanical, not inert, something soft, something that had been alive, or at least appeared to have once been. The earliest murmurs came not from town gossip but from inside the base, where, according to some, a second recovery site had been cordoned off even more tightly than the first. This wasn't the field filled with foil and rods and memory metal. This was somewhere else, a ravine perhaps, a site tucked out of view, reported only to the highest-ranking officers, and there, they say, were the bodies. Descriptions vary. Some claim there were 3, others say 5. A few insist one was alive, barely. But all agree on the features. Small, no more than 4 feet in height. Frail limbs, spindly and strange. Oversized heads with disproportionately large eyes. No visible ears. Narrow mouths. Some claim the skin was grey and smooth. Others said it looked like it had been burned. Darkened, swollen. Difficult to classify. No clothing, or if there was, it was form-fitting and seamless, like a jumpsuit with no buttons, zippers or stitching. There was debate over the number of fingers, 3, 4, 5. But what stuck with every witness was not the anatomy. It was the feeling, the overwhelming sense that these were not human remains. Then came the counter-narrative. In 1997, 50 years after the incident, the United States Air Force released a report titled The Roswell Report. Case closed. It was presented as the definitive answer to decades of speculation. The conclusion? The bodies described by witnesses were test dummies, anthropomorphic figures dropped from high-altitude balloons in the 1950s as part of aeronautical safety testing. According to the report, these dummies were used to study how pilots might survive ejection and parachute landings at high speed and altitude. The materials matched. The timing, sort of, matched. The conclusion? People were simply confused. They remembered things out of sequence. They mistook plastic mannequins for aliens. The matter was closed. Except, of course, it wasn't. Because the dummies in question weren't deployed until the 1950s, almost a full decade after the Roswell incident. The Air Force report acknowledged this discrepancy and dismissed it as memory distortion, suggesting that aging witnesses had conflated multiple events. But the problem with that explanation is simple. It assumes the witnesses were not just wrong about the bodies, but wrong about the entire timeline of their own lives. That they had somehow retroactively placed dummies into a completely unrelated memory from a decade earlier, across different states, bases, and operations. It also fails to explain the more chilling details that surfaced in sworn affidavits. Like the base nurse who, according to Glenn Dennis, described assisting with an autopsy, not of a mannequin, but of something never seen before. Like the officer who claimed that the wreckage was stored in Hangar 84 alongside unusual cargo sealed in body bags. Like the enlisted men who later admitted to helping transport long, narrow crates, under armed guard, with explicit instructions not to look or ask. And there is another problem with the dummy explanation. The dummies themselves were unmistakably human in shape, 6 feet tall, full-sized, clearly artificial, joints visible, seams exposed, clothing attached with Velcro. Anyone who saw one up close would recognize it as a testing device. Yet the bodies described in Roswell were not like that. They were shorter, stranger, more organic, and most damning of all, some witnesses described smell. One of the soldiers on site claimed the air around the bodies was different, sour, coppery, like something decaying. That detail may seem small, but it is deeply human. Machines don't rot. Plastic doesn't bleed. You don't forget the smell of death, and no dummy ever gave off that scent. Some say the Air Force was trying to provide a halfway answer, a bridge between full disclosure and total denial. By attributing the bodies to dummies, they acknowledged something had been seen, but insisted it was benign, misremembered, a bureaucratic mix-up. But the emotional tone of the reports from 1947 doesn't match that kind of error. People weren't confused, they were shaken. And not just because they'd seen something unusual, but because they'd seen something that changed the boundaries of what was possible. There's a reason the bodies remain the most controversial element of Roswell, because they force a decision. The metal might have been experimental, the symbols might have been foreign, the crash might have been Soviet or classified, but a body, an organism, is binary. It's human or it's not. And once you admit it's not, the door doesn't just crack, it flies open. Some researchers believe that's why the bodies, more than any other aspect of the incident, have been surrounded with layers of obfuscation. Not just denial, but ridicule. When you reduce the witnesses to people who couldn't tell a mannequin from a Martian, you erode the foundation of the event. You don't just challenge the facts, you challenge the dignity of those who reported them. There's one more wrinkle in all this. A quiet, persistent claim that no one wants to talk about in the open. It's the idea that the bodies were not found intact, that some were dismembered, burned, fragmented, that whatever came down in the desert wasn't a clean landing, it was violent, catastrophic. There are even stories, few but consistent, that suggest medical teams at the base attempted resuscitation, that at least one of the beings may have been responsive, if only barely, that it blinked, that it moved its fingers, that someone tried to speak to it before it expired. These stories are unverifiable. Most who've shared them did so anonymously or under protection, but they persist. And in the absence of documentation, consistency begins to look like a kind of truth. So we return to the question, bodies or dummies? If they were dummies, then the witnesses were all wrong. Every one of them. Trained officers, nurses, soldiers, children, locals, all simultaneously misremembering plastic mannequins as living organisms a decade before those mannequins were even deployed in the region. If they were bodies, then the story we've been told for 70 years collapses. Not just the story of Roswell, the story of us. And that, perhaps, is why the answer remains so elusive. Because to admit that the bodies were real, not plastic, not test subjects, not errors, requires us to revisit everything else we think we know. About government, about secrecy, about what's flying above us when the sky is quiet, about who or what might be visiting when it isn't. To understand how the government eventually explained Roswell, you have to understand a project that was never supposed to be public in the first place. A project so secret it didn't officially exist. A project cloaked not in the language of saucers and aliens, but in acronyms, memos, and scientific jargon. That project was called Mogul, and it was, according to the Air Force and several follow-up investigations, the true source of the debris recovered on the Foster Ranch in July of 1947. On paper, Project Mogul was simple. It was a classified program run by the US Army Air Forces and developed in partnership with scientists from New York University and other institutions. Its goal was to detect Soviet nuclear tests by launching high-altitude balloons equipped with sensitive microphones into the upper atmosphere. These balloons would ride the edge of space and listen, not for voices or signals, but for sound waves produced by atomic explosions. Nuclear blasts, even those underground or underwater, send out low-frequency acoustic pulses called infrasound. These pulses can travel for thousands of miles, bouncing through the upper atmosphere, invisible and inaudible to human ears but traceable by delicate instruments. Mogul was born from a single, urgent fear that the Soviet Union, now in possession of stolen atomic secrets, would soon conduct its own nuclear tests, and that the United States needed a way to detect them quickly and at distance. Satellite technology didn't exist yet. Spy planes were still years away from practical use, but sound could be caught. sound could be monitored from above. So the solution, clever in its simplicity, was to suspend sensitive acoustic equipment beneath a chain of weather balloons and float them into the stratosphere. There, above the noise of civilization, they would drift across continents, silently eavesdropping on the Earth itself. The equipment required for this was anything but elegant. Mogul flights were massive constructs, arrays of latex balloons stitched together in long vertical chains, carrying reflectors, sensors, radios, batteries, and antennae. These payloads were often wrapped in foil for insulation, affixed with lightweight balsa wood frames, and occasionally tagged with markings for recovery. Each launch was a technological Frankenstein's monster, delicate, awkward, and prone to failure. Early iterations crashed frequently, scattered debris, and left scientists scrambling to recover or conceal the wreckage. In theory, one of these early test flights, Flight 4, launched from Alamogordo on June 4th, 1947, is what came down near Roswell. That's the official story. According to the Air Force's 1994 and 1995 reports, Flight 4 was lost due to equipment failure. It drifted off course and likely burst from overexpansion in the upper atmosphere. The debris then descended, lightweight scattered by the wind, onto the Foster Ranch, where Mac Brazel found it days later, igniting a cascade of misunderstanding that would snowball into conspiracy. On the surface, this seems plausible. Mogul flights did use foil. They did employ odd materials. They were top secret. It's easy to imagine how a rancher, unfamiliar with cutting-edge military experiments, might find the debris and assume it was something unusual. It's equally easy to imagine the military, eager to protect a classified program, clumsily covering up the incident by redirecting public interest toward more mundane explanations. But dig deeper, and the story begins to strain. To begin with, there is no complete record of Flight 4. In fact, most records of that launch, including logs, tracking data, and recovery notes, are missing, inconsistent, or were never kept. When investigators tried to reconstruct the flight path decades later, they found only fragments, vague launch times, no coordinates, no confirmation of payload contents. Some experts even dispute whether Flight 4 launched at all. Other flights, launched before and after, are well documented. But Flight 4? A black hole? A convenient ghost? Then there's the matter of the materials. Project Mogul balloons were built from off-the-shelf parts. Radar reflectors made of balsa wood and foil, standard-issue neoprene or latex envelopes, simple cloth string. The more elaborate Mogul arrays weren't deployed until later years. What Mac Brazel described, and what Major Jesse Marcel confirmed, doesn't line up with any known configuration of balloon hardware. The memory metal, the symbolic markings, the unterable foil, all of it defies Mogul's known inventory. The Air Force, in its official report, tried to address this by claiming that the foil may have been reinforced with tape, printed with decorative symbols, flowers maybe, or geometric patterns, produced by a toy company and used without thought to the implications. That those hieroglyphs were nothing more than the accidental result of off-brand masking tape. But again, this strains belief. Are we to assume that highly classified military technology was being assembled using toy store adhesives? And if so, how does one explain the dozens of witnesses who describe the symbols not as cartoonish or colourful, but as precise, subtle, and foreign? The timing is also suspect. The Air Force insists that the Roswell crash was a misunderstanding born of urgency and classification. Yet it took 47 years for Project Mogul to be publicly linked to the incident. Until the 1990s, the balloon explanation was just that, a vague suggestion with no named project attached. Only after intense public interest, Freedom of Information Act requests, and congressional pressure did the government produce the Mogul story. It was not volunteered, it was not transparent, it was reactive. There's also the matter of scale. The debris field described by Brazel and others covered nearly a mile. It included both scattered wreckage and more concentrated zones of metallic material. Multiple military vehicles were dispatched to collect it. Officers were flown in. If this was just a balloon, why the overkill? Why the secrecy? Why the base lockdown? Why in the midst of Cold War intelligence anxiety would a single balloon crash justify such a coordinated response? Proponents of the Mogul theory argue that the program's sensitivity was reason enough, that the balloon itself wasn't mysterious, but the purpose behind it was, that the government wasn't hiding aliens, just hiding microphones meant to listen for Soviet bombs, and that perhaps the alien story was allowed to spread precisely because it was less dangerous than the truth. It's a compelling twist, the idea that the Air Force didn't create the UFO myth, but simply let it breathe, let it grow. Because if the public believed in sources, they wouldn't ask questions about secret balloon programs flying over foreign airspace. That maybe, just maybe, the alien narrative became a kind of unintentional smokescreen. A lie that protected a bigger secret, just not the one we thought. And yet, that doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the bodies. It doesn't explain the nurse who vanished. It doesn't explain the officers who changed their stories decades later. And it doesn't explain why people who touched the debris said it didn't behave like anything known to man. Not in 1947, and not now. So, what was Project Mogul? It was real. It was secret. It was ambitious. It was imperfect. It was, by all available records, an important step in early Cold War surveillance. But whether it was the cause of the Roswell incident is something else entirely. Because sometimes, truth is not a thing you find. It's a thing you choose. And the government, with all its data and diagrams and confident denials, chose a version of the truth it thought we could accept. Whether we should is another question altogether. For most of the Roswell story, the United States Air Force takes center stage. The crash, the debris, the press release, the retraction, the contradictions. But quietly, almost too quietly, the Federal Bureau of Investigation slipped in and out of the narrative, leaving behind a footprint so faint that for decades, it was all but ignored. The Bureau didn't release a press statement. It didn't call any press conferences. It barely left a paper trail. But the trail exists, and where it leads, or more importantly where it stops, raises some of the most unsettling questions of all. The evidence comes down almost entirely to a single document. One memo, one paragraph. Unearthed years later by researchers and declassified through the Freedom of Information Act, it is, at first glance, unremarkable. Dated July 8th, 1947, the very day the Roswell press release hit the wire. It was sent from the FBI office in Dallas, Texas to the director of the Bureau, J. Edgar Hoover himself. The memo describes a phone call with an Army Air Force investigator based in Fort Worth, Texas, and what it reports is simple, terse, and deeply provocative. The memo reads, "The disc is hexagonal in shape and was suspended from a balloon by cable, which balloon was approximately 20 feet in diameter. The object found resembles a high-altitude weather balloon with a radar reflector. But that telephonic conversation between this office and name redacted of Army Airfield Intelligence, who stated that the object found was a disc and is being transported to Wright Field by special plane for examination. That's it. No mention of extraterrestrial origin, no diagrams, no dramatic language, just a flat procedural sentence. But what makes this fragment extraordinary is not what it says, it's what it suggests. Because this was the FBI, not the Air Force, not the sheriff, not a reporter, a civilian law enforcement agency whose jurisdiction didn't typically cover experimental aircraft or meteorological equipment. For the Bureau to be contacted at all, something more than a weather balloon had to be at stake. The memo is strange in other ways. It refers to the object as both a balloon and a disc. That contradiction isn't explained. It notes that the object was being transported to Wright Field, now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, for examination. A detail that aligns with other testimonies, but diverges from the official weather balloon story, which claimed that all relevant debris had been accounted for and posed no mystery. The mere involvement of Wright Field, known at the time as the military's central hub for foreign technology analysis and crash retrieval research, deepens the ambiguity. What did the FBI expect to find? Why were they involved at all? The answer, if it exists, may be buried in the Bureau's early role as a catch-all agency for unusual phenomena. In the years following World War II, the FBI found itself handling a strange mixture of cases: espionage, stolen atomic secrets, industrial sabotage, and occasionally events that defied easy categorization. UFO sightings were often filed under unusual aerial phenomena, and depending on their proximity to sensitive installations, fell under Bureau scrutiny. But Roswell was something else. This wasn't a light in the sky. This was wreckage, physical material, allegedly recovered bodies. It should have been outside the FBI's purview, and yet they were there, almost immediately. Some researchers believe the FBI's involvement was initiated not by the military, but by internal alarms. That when the initial flying disc story hit the news, the Bureau's Dallas office reached out to Fort Worth to clarify whether the object posed any national security concern. That conversation triggered the memo to Hoover, which then vanished into the black hole of post-war federal secrecy. J. Edgar Hoover himself never commented publicly on Roswell, but notes from his internal files, obtained decades later, show that he was intensely interested in aerial phenomena, especially anything that could involve foreign technology or deception. Hoover distrusted the military. He was territorial. He believed, often rightly, that military intelligence withheld information from the Bureau, and he wanted control. In one marginal note, scrawled in Hoover's unmistakable handwriting, he laments that the Army won't let us have it for cursory examination. The context of this line remains debated. Some say it refers to another case entirely. Others argue it is direct reference to Roswell or one of the follow-up incidents. But the tone is telling. Hoover wanted access. He was not getting it. And that silence, the sharp cut-off after the July 8th memo, is what haunts the story. No follow-up, no summary report, no closing file, just a single memo, and then nothing. It's possible that the FBI's involvement was minimal, that they called, received a benign explanation, and moved on. But that doesn't fit the pattern, because in cases where the Bureau was satisfied it left a record of conclusion, no further action required, debunked, explained to satisfaction. These phrases appear all over their files from the 1940s and 50s. Roswell? Nothing. That absence suggests a deliberate shutdown, not confusion, not incompetence, but containment. What's more, some former Bureau agents, speaking years after their retirement, hinted that Roswell was above Bureau clearance. One, quoted anonymously in a 1980s documentary, stated flatly, "There were projects we were told not to touch. That was one of them." When pressed, he offered no specifics, just a look, the kind of look that says, "Don't ask again." By the time the UFO community turned its full attention to Roswell in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the FBI had long stopped commenting. The Bureau's response to FOIA requests was slow, often fragmented. Pages were returned with redactions. Entire files were said to have been misplaced. When a researcher asked why the Bureau hadn't investigated more deeply, the response was bureaucratic. We defer to the United States Air Force in matters concerning aerial recovery operations. But that's the tell, isn't it? Because the FBI doesn't defer, it investigates, unless it's told not to. The single memo from July 8th has become one of the most analysed documents in the Roswell case. Not because it provides answers, but because it confirms the existence of questions. Questions that reached all the way to the top. Questions that were acknowledged, then silenced. The FBI did not open a full case file, it did not interview witnesses, it did not follow up, but it did make a phone call, and it did send a report to Hoover. And that report described something being flown across state lines, under military escort to a base known for its handling of recovered foreign craft. And then, the Bureau closed its eyes, or someone closed them for it. In a story filled with speculation, this may be the most solid evidence of all, that on the very day the world was told a flying disc had been found, the FBI took it seriously enough to write a memo, and then never said another word. Long after the desert went quiet and the debris was hauled away, long after the press release was retracted and the Army resumed its day-to-day business of flying planes and tightening lips, Roswell refused to disappear. Unlike most government mishaps which vanish behind the bureaucratic curtain of time, Roswell became something else entirely. Not a case file, not a scandal, but a seed. One that would take root in the collective imagination and grow, relentlessly, spectacularly, into one of the strangest, most enduring belief systems of the 20th century. This segment is not about what was found in the desert. It's about what was left behind in the minds of those who heard the story. It's about the cultural fallout, how Roswell became a myth, a movement, a mirror. At first, it lay dormant. After the initial confusion and hasty retraction, the Roswell story slipped beneath the surface. The public, whiplashed by the conflicting reports and dulled by a post-war media landscape, moved on. There were bigger things to worry about. Inflation, reconstruction, the Soviet threat, the accelerating drumbeat of nuclear paranoia. For a decade, the incident gathered dust, but not silence, because in the background something else was changing, the mood of the country and the shape of the skies. In the 1950s, America became obsessed with the sky. Jet engines were shrieking to life, rockets were blasting off experimental pads, satellites were creeping toward plausibility, and above it all, both metaphorically and sometimes literally, there was the unknown, a glowing disk, a flashing light, a sudden hum in the stillness. UFO sightings surged. From sleepy towns in Iowa to radar stations in New Jersey, the reports piled up like leaves before a storm. And with them came something new, fear, not just of the otherworldly, but of the idea that someone else might be watching, flying, surveilling. That our skies, our final domain of sovereignty, were porous. The US government scrambled to respond. First came Project Sign, then Project Grudge, and finally the infamous Project Blue Book. Each one was tasked with collecting, categorizing, and, let's be honest, neutralizing the phenomenon. The goal wasn't to find aliens, it was to contain belief. The army knew that rumors moved faster than facts, and that belief, once rooted, could grow into something impossible to cut down. They had seen it happen already, in 1947, in Roswell. But by then, the myth was already spreading. Not in files or photos, but in something far more potent. Stories. It started in pulp fiction. Cheap paperbacks, riddled with dramatic fonts and atomic age paranoia. Flying saucers on the covers, bug-eyed monsters inside. The aliens were invaders, saviors, warnings. Sometimes they looked like us, sometimes they didn't. Always they came from above. Then came the movies, The Day the Earth Stood Still, Earth versus the Flying Saucers, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, each one a cinematic echo of Roswell, sometimes direct, sometimes distorted. The plots were never about Roswell explicitly, but the DNA was there, a crashed craft, a secret government, a terrified public. The paranoia was coded into every frame. Aliens became metaphors for communists, for fascists, for the unknowable other. And just like that, Roswell slipped from the realm of news into the bloodstream of American fiction. By the 1960s, something extraordinary happened. Roswell, nearly forgotten for a decade, began to resurface, but not as a mystery, as a movement. UFO clubs began to form, civilian saucer investigations, conventions, newsletters typed on mimeograph machines and mailed to subscribers. Men and women in small towns began trading stories like gospel, not just about lights in the sky, but about cover-ups. The government was hiding something. They knew more than they were saying. There were witnesses, there were bodies, there were lies. The counterculture grabbed onto this with both hands. In a decade defined by protest, mistrust, and social upheaval, the UFO narrative was a perfect fit. If the government lied about Vietnam, about Watergate, about civil rights, why not about aliens? The idea was no longer fringe. It was rebellious. The UFO became a symbol not of curiosity, but of defiance, a rejection of official narratives, a belief that truth, real truth, lived outside the press release. By the 1980s, Roswell was back in the headlines. The resurgence began with books, The Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and William Moore being the most influential. It claimed, without reservation, that what crashed in 1947 was not a balloon but a spacecraft, that there were bodies, that witnesses had been silenced, that the government knew. These claims were not universally accepted, but they ignited something. Talk shows lit up. Conspiracy radio went full volume. Old soldiers and ranch hands began to speak, some for the first time, others for the last. The mythology solidified. Then came the 1990s, and with it, a surge of pop culture that would catapult Roswell into permanent orbit. The X-Files became a cultural juggernaut. Independence Day turned Area 51 into a punchline and a plot device. Roswell wasn't just an event anymore. It was a genre, a setting, a shorthand for every suspicion Americans had about secrecy, surveillance, and stars too bright to be explained. The term crash site no longer meant a plane, it meant Roswell. Tourism followed, a museum was built, a festival launched. Costumes, collectibles, t-shirts and keychains. Roswell became a town with two realities, one historical, one mythical, and they were increasingly impossible to separate. Visitors came by the thousands, Some wanted answers, others just wanted the photo op. Either way, the myth was alive, and the town embraced it. What makes this cultural fallout so remarkable is that it never needed confirmation. No one proved aliens crashed, no new document ever settled the debate, and yet belief grew. Not always in the event, but in the possibility. Roswell became a symbol, a cipher, a way for people to talk about the ineffable, trust, wonder, betrayal, the infinite. And maybe that's what it was always about. Because Roswell didn't just create believers, it created skeptics. It birthed a whole generation of Americans who learned to question official explanations, to look past headlines, to wonder what else might be hidden under tarps in locked hangars. It shaped how we think about secrecy, about truth, about what governments owe their people and what people owe to their own curiosity. That's the real legacy of the crash. Not what fell, but what rose in its place. A mythology, a movement, a mirror. And we're still staring into it. Time has a way of softening facts into folklore and sharpening doubt into dogma. As the years stretched out from that fateful summer of 1947, Roswell gradually transformed from a news blip into a cultural volcano. For decades, the official story, first flying disc, then weather balloon, and finally Project Mogul, remained firmly in place. And yet, curiously, the silence did not hold. Not entirely. Because as the years passed, so did fear. Men and women who had once guarded their memories like state secrets began, in old age, to unlock them. Some gave interviews, some signed affidavits, some whispered through the static of phone calls with researchers, and in doing so they added a strange, deeply personal new layer to the story of Roswell, one that no memo or photograph could ever fully explain. These late-life confessions, often dismissed by skeptics but treasured by believers, form one of the most emotionally compelling aspects of the entire saga. They do not always agree, they sometimes contradict each other, and yet what binds them is not consistency, but urgency, a shared need to finally speak aloud what had been hidden under layers of fear, duty and time. Perhaps the most famous of these voices belongs to Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer who first recovered debris from the Foster Ranch and brought it back to Roswell Army Airfield. At the time of the crash, Marcel dutifully followed orders, posed with weather balloon debris for the stage press photos, and said nothing publicly. But in the late 1970s, he began to talk, not loudly, but definitively. In interviews with researchers like Stanton Friedman, and in appearances on national television, Marcel described the material he recovered as not of this earth. He spoke of foil that would not crumple, beams with strange symbols, and fragments that resisted destruction. He said plainly, again and again, that the debris shown to the press was not the same as what he found in the desert. It was a cover story, he said, the biggest one ever put out. Skeptics pointed out that Marcel had no physical proof, no saved samples, no photographs. They questioned his memory, his motives, even his mental clarity. But Marcel never recanted. Until his death in 1986, he maintained that what he found on that ranch was extraordinary. He did not claim to understand it. He simply refused to lie about it anymore. Marcel's testimony opened the floodgates. Once he spoke, others followed. Frank Kaufman, a civilian employee at the Roswell base, came forward claiming to have been part of a special recovery team. He described a crash site with wreckage and bodies, small humanoid beings, some dead, some barely alive. Kaufman painted a cinematic picture: scorched earth, secret trucks, guarded hangars, autopsies in motion. His interviews were breathless and theatrical. For years he was treated as a star witness, until documents he provided were revealed to be forgeries. Some believe he embellished a kernel of truth. Others think he created a fiction whole cloth. Still, his account spoke to a larger hunger, a need to fill in the blanks, even if the truth was elusive. Then there was Glenn Dennis, a young mortician working at the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell in 1947. In the 1990s, he claimed that the base called him frantically inquiring about child-sized caskets. He recounted a conversation with a nurse from the base hospital who described seeing small, non-human bodies, some severely injured, with features that defied anatomy textbooks. Dennis said the nurse was deeply shaken and feared for her life. Shortly after their last meeting, he claimed, she was abruptly transferred and never heard from again. Her identity, curiously, was never confirmed. Some researchers believe she never existed. Others think Dennis, fearing retribution, altered her name or details. The criticism didn't faze him. Until his death, Dennis stood by his story. He didn't seek money or fame. He was polite, measured, and clearly disturbed by what he remembered. "It's not about proving anything," he once said in an interview. "It's about telling the truth while I still can." Many of the most compelling confessions came from anonymous sources, men who served in the military and only spoke once they had retired, women who worked on base and whispered stories to grandchildren. In interviews conducted by UFO investigators, they described locked rooms, late-night arrivals, cargo wrapped in canvas, guards who refused to speak, and whispers of non-terrestrial biologics. A few spoke of flights to Wright Field under tight security. Some mentioned quarantine procedures. Others recalled strange odours, as if what had arrived was not merely mechanical but organic. None of these accounts came with physical proof, no photographs, no autopsy videos, just stories, fragile, human stories, etched into the faces of those who'd carried them for half a century. Were they lying? Misremembering? Deluded? Perhaps, but it's hard to dismiss the weight in their eyes. The trembling pauses, the way their voices caught when asked what they saw, or what they were told never to repeat. One anonymous interviewee, a former radar operator, described the way information was handled on the base. "You didn't ask questions," he said. "You didn't need to be told it was classified. You could feel it. The way people moved, the way orders were barked and not explained. You learned to shut your mouth and do your job, but you never forgot." Perhaps most chilling was the testimony of Lieutenant Walter Haut, the public information officer who issued the original press release about the recovered flying disc. For years, Haut downplayed his involvement, suggesting he had merely followed orders. But in a sealed affidavit released after his death in 2005, he told a different story. He claimed to have seen not just debris, but alien bodies, described in similar terms to other witnesses, child-sized, fragile, with large heads and slanted eyes. He described being taken to a hangar where the bodies were stored and being briefed on the need for absolute secrecy. His affidavit was matter-of-fact, almost chillingly so. If true, it meant that the man who once told the world a flying disc had been recovered had lived the rest of his life knowing exactly what it was, and choosing silence. Not all the witnesses were grand in scope. Some simply remembered the feeling. A civilian clerk recalled unusual tension on base. A nurse remembered cleaning a surgical suite under unusually strict instructions. A janitor described guards posted at every hallway. None could say exactly what had happened. They only knew something had, something that left an imprint far deeper than a crash site. What do we make of all this? In legal terms, eyewitness testimony is considered the most compelling form of evidence, and the least reliable. Memory fades, bias creeps in, stories evolve. But these confessions, these final unburdenings, are not about legal proof. They're about emotional truth. They reveal what Roswell became, not just as an incident, but as a secret shared by the aging and the haunted. A moment in time that split reality into two timelines, one official and one remembered. We can't verify these stories, but we also can't explain them away entirely. Their convergence, on detail, tone and shape, suggests either a shared delusion or a shared event, something powerful enough to mark the memories of soldiers, nurses, ranchers and civilians across 5 decades. And if it wasn't a flying saucer, then what exactly was it? In the end, perhaps the testimonies themselves are the wreckage, fragments of a truth that fell from the sky and was hastily collected, reassembled and hidden away, leaving behind only those who touched it, who saw it, who lived with the knowledge of something extraordinary, and finally, when the world had stopped listening, found the courage to whisper it anyway. As we stand at the precipice of everything we've explored, an entire constellation of facts, testimonies, lies, cover stories, speculation and shadow, we are left with the question that has hummed beneath every sentence of this strange journey. What really crashed in Roswell, New Mexico? It is not a simple question. It never was. It masquerades as a puzzle, a whodunit, a crime to be solved by logic and deduction. But in truth, it is more like a riddle, one whose answer shifts depending on who is speaking and when and why. Over the decades, countless theories have emerged. Some gleam with the polish of official narrative, others thrum with the electricity of something long denied. None are complete, all are seductive. Let us begin with the most prosaic, and perhaps the most suspiciously tidy, Project Mogul. This is the theory that now sits in the vault of official explanation, the story retconned into place decades after the fact. According to the Air Force's 1994 report, what crashed in Roswell was not a flying saucer, not a weather balloon, not a Russian weapon, but a classified balloon array designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests using high-altitude microphones. The program, known as Mogul, was top secret at the time and involved complex balloon trains made of neoprene, foil reflectors, and radar targets. Some of these components, especially the balsa wood struts and foil, resembled the very materials described by Major Jesse Marcel and others in 1947. On paper, it fits. The timing, the secrecy, the physical description. But there are cracks. Why, for instance, did the initial press release describe a flying disc? Why did the military rush to cover up the event if it was simply a balloon? Why transport weather balloon debris to Wright Field, hundreds of miles away? And if this was truly the explanation, why did it take nearly 50 years to release it? The Mogul theory has become the bureaucratic shield, a story safe enough to be plausible, dull enough to be forgettable. But for those who have peered too long into this mystery, it feels like a painting that has been touched up too many times. Something underneath still shows through. Then there is the darker version, the foreign technology theory. Some researchers believe what fell in Roswell wasn't extraterrestrial at all, but foreign, terrestrial and monstrous in a different way. According to this hypothesis, the object was a Soviet craft, perhaps a captured Nazi experiment, launched as psychological warfare. Some even claim it contained human guinea pigs, deformed children or prisoners, surgically altered to appear alien as part of some grotesque ruse. This theory often points to Joseph Stalin's documented interest in mass psychological operations and the grotesque legacy of Nazi experimentation in camps like Dachau and Auschwitz. It is a chilling theory. And unlike the Mogul explanation, it accounts for both the secrecy and the rumours of bodies. But it raises as many questions as it answers. Would the Soviets really risk launching such a craft into US airspace in peacetime? How would they recover it if it succeeded? And why, if this was the truth, would the United States not use it as proof of Soviet villainy during the Cold War propaganda blitz? Some dismiss this theory as grotesque fantasy. Others argue it is the only explanation that accounts for both the official silence and the whispered horror. After all, aliens might be frightening. But governments, history reminds us, can be far worse. And then, of course, we arrive at the most infamous theory of them all, that it was exactly what the first press release said it was: a flying disc, an alien spacecraft, a vehicle not of this Earth. To the skeptic, this theory is laughable. It lacks physical proof, relies on hearsay, and defies the known laws of physics. But to the believer, those same absences are the fingerprints of a cover-up. Why else, they ask, would the story be so aggressively retracted? Why would witnesses be silenced, affidavits sealed, evidence destroyed or sequestered? Why would the government lie unless it had something to lie about? This theory does not hinge on science. It hinges on human behaviour, and human behaviour, in the Roswell case, is undeniably strange. This version of events holds that a craft of unknown origin malfunctioned, or was struck by lightning during a storm and crashed near Roswell. Debris was scattered across the Foster Ranch. Bodies, humanoid but not human, were recovered. A team was dispatched. Civilians were warned, silenced, or recruited. The wreckage was transported under guard. And then the story was changed, rewritten, erased. This theory has evolved over time, shaped by witness testimonies, books, films, and imagination. It is no longer just a hypothesis. It is a mythology, and like all mythologies, it reflects something deeper than fact. It reflects longing, fear, wonder, the human desire to look up and not see ourselves staring back. And yet, this theory too has gaps. There is no definitive physical evidence, no publicly confirmed photographs, no surviving wreckage, no government admission. We have only stories. And for many that is not enough. So we find ourselves in a hall of mirrors. Each theory explains something, but none explain everything. Mogul explains the debris, but not the behaviour. The Soviet theory explains the secrecy, but not the silence. The extraterrestrial theory explains the awe, but not the absence. Which leaves us with the possibility that Roswell is not a single event, but a collision of events, a crash of something strange, a rush of military confusion, a Cold War backdrop of paranoia, a story too strange to be false, too garbled to be true. And in the decades since, the meaning of Roswell has grown larger than any one explanation. It has become a cultural archetype, a modern Rosetta Stone for fear, secrecy, and the desire to know what's really out there. Perhaps the real answer lies not in wreckage or witnesses, but in why we keep asking. Why this story, among thousands of anomalies, refuses to die. Why old men cry on camera when they talk about what they saw. Why thousands of people visit Roswell every year, not for proof, but for pilgrimage. Why a single desert night in 1947 continues to pulse like a beacon through the fog of history. Perhaps Roswell was a balloon. Perhaps it was a weapon. Perhaps it was a visitor. Or perhaps, and this is the most difficult theory of all, it was something we're not ready to understand. A mirror too vast, too dark, too true. Whatever it was, it fell. And it changed the world, whether we know it or not. Somewhere out in the high plains of New Mexico, the wind still moves across the mesquite. The sand still shifts where hoofprints once marked a startled rancher's path. And if you listen very closely, closer than reason would ever recommend, you might still hear it. A distant hum, a flicker of static, the rustle of brush disturbed by something that once fell from the sky and never quite rose again. And now, dear listener, we bring this episode to a close. If you made it to the end, if you're hearing this now, then I want you to know how much I appreciate you. You're not just a listener, you're a fellow traveller in this nighttime expedition, stumbling through the dark with your flashlight of curiosity. This episode, like all the others, was made for you. If you enjoyed the trip, if you felt a tingle up your spine, or found yourself staring at the ceiling wondering what's really out there, please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a review. It helps more than you know. It lets the algorithm know that strange, slow, dreamy inquiry still has a place in this loud, fast world. It lets me keep whispering stories into the dark, hoping someone, maybe you, will still be listening. And if you're lying there now, eyes heavy, brain buzzing with aliens and army cover-ups and maybe just a bit of static in the silence, good. That's exactly where I hope to leave you. Good night. This has been The Midnight Inquiry.